Hey folks, so let's talk a little bit today about writing in the real world. You guys have been taught for years about how to write an essay, but most of that is just like sort of basic structure that is not inherently aimed at the way people write in day-to-day living. So let's start simple. You guys have all been taught how to write thesis statements, and generally you were taught how to write that thesis statement, right? That's I like X because of A, B, and C, right? We get these thesis statements that have three parts that you can, of course, go and support. And even if they're not, they're sort of just like a vague opinion thesis statement. So this is the sample essay that I shared. And the thesis statement, looking at the design of the study as well as who funded the studies, it's easy to see how the two studies, there's even a typo right there, came to different conclusions, even if it's hard to know who's right. Now, what's different about this from what you've been taught? Well, first of all, there's no opinion. I suppose it's an opinion in that one might argue that, the studies didn't come to different conclusions, or that if you look at the design of the study, you can't tell which one is why they have differences. But at the end of the day, it's not quite a fact. It's something that is debatable, but it's not strictly an opinion. It's not an I like. It's not an I should. It's nothing that we couldn't argue against. Okay, and that's key and super important. The other thing here is that the author is not giving away the end of the paper. One of the problems we've had is that what you've been taught is the thesis statement is really your conclusion. If your thesis statement's got the word should in it, that's really your conclusion. Okay, and we'll see this as we get into the long research project at the end of the semester. That really the shoulds are solutions that we might talk about in the long run. But the first thing we need to do is sort of do a test. And that's really what my thesis statement here in this essay does. Now, let's talk about structure. You guys have been taught this structure. You have a broad introduction that lays out a thesis statement. That thesis statement is supported in multiple different ways. You write a paragraph about each of those different things, and then in your conclusion, you restate your introduction, more or less. You restate your thesis. Okay? This is the structure you've been taught. But the bottom line is, literally no one outside of college classrooms and high school classrooms actually writes this way. Let's take a look at the sample essay again and see what we see there. Okay, so first and foremost, we've looked at the thesis statement and seen sort of how that's different. This is the end of the first body or second body paragraph, excuse me. The first two body paragraphs there just sort of summarize each author's work. Okay, so we get the end of this paragraph saying her results show that waist circumference, blah 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 blah. This is sort of a summation of what they come of the conclusions of the author there, who gained more than those who didn't drink diet soda at all. Now, what we know at this point in the paper is that we've looked at two articles and they come to radically different conclusions about whether or not diet sodas help you lose weight. So the next thing that the author does here is to exploit that feeling in the reader and say, well, why the huge discrepancy? Now, you don't need to ask a question here. You could make a statement. What's interesting is that there is a huge discrepancy, and then you can go in and talk about the huge discrepancy. The point I want to make here is that what the author does is takes the reader exactly where they are. The reader can see, looking at these two summaries, that there is a big discrepancy between the two findings, and they have that question, why? Your job as a writer is to use your next paragraph to answer that. Every time your reader has a question, has a thought, your job as the writer is to fill the gap. Let's keep on moving here and take a look at this. Okay, so this is the end of that paragraph we were just looking at. So the study design, or rather the data that Fowler had access to, simply makes it impossible to tell. So here I move, okay, so we've pointed out that this is the reason there's sort of this discrepancy. And then I say, on the surface, it looks like this is the case. Okay, the author's work here is such that we're setting up a sort of presumed conclusion. On the surface, it appears this way. Of course, the next paragraph goes to break that down. So if we see, if one looks at the conflict of interest statement, the results of Peter's study become even more dubious. So this is actually a second paragraph sort of talking about the problems in Peter's study. So one thing that's different from the way you guys have traditionally been taught is that in this situation, it makes perfect sense to spend a paragraph or 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs looking at a single topic. Before you might say, okay, everything about this concept needs to be in this paragraph. Well, if you've got multiple different ways in which you need to address this topic, give it multiple paragraphs. That's what creates a longer and more nuanced and more complex piece of writing, and that's what we're looking for here. So in this case, all the author's given us is a second paragraph explaining ultimately the problems in Peter's study. And then again, this is the point where the reader theoretically is going, okay, so is Peter's study totally garbage? And the author works immediately to try to, again, answer that question in the reader's mind, okay? And that's the entire essay here. But you can see how these paragraphs move through the reader's thought process, and they help the reader to process the information you're giving. And that's really the key to being a successful writer, not thesis statement, okay, here's a paragraph that supports thesis, another paragraph that supports thesis, another paragraph that supports thesis, but anticipating what the reader's questions are and answering them as they have them. Finally, tone, style, etc., etc., etc. Look, this is the very first paragraph of that sample essay, and look at what we get here. Of course. Now, of course, seems like it's a throwaway phrase, but it actually does something cognitive here. It's setting up the idea that everyone would generally agree that this is the case. After all, again, it sort of pushes that notion that everyone would sort of agree with this. Of course, then the bomb gets dropped here with, however, there's some confusion about this. And even look at this. The author used italics here. The italics in this situation really point out the big discrepancy between the two schools of thought on drinking diet soda. Okay, these are really subtle things, but and it's not that I would say, oh, use of course anytime you're writing an essay. What I would say, though, is be cognizant of what you're trying to accomplish and think about how these sort of word choices can help you accomplish that. Can contrast one idea to another, make one idea appear obvious and simple. Think about what you're trying to do and what words you might be able to use in order to convey that message. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know.